So it's great that we are all excited about AI, right? I mean, we're super excited. There's a lot of potential here, and wherever you look, particularly if you want to look at the right or the wrong places, you feel that energy and excitement. But what does people really feel about AI? How do our spouses, our family members, people in schools, etc., feel about AI? I think this is very interesting because without that question solved and understood, well, we will keep on being excited about this, but people in general might be worried, might be scared about this. So this is really what this is about. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that we have made tremendous strides in the AI technology over the last 10 years. It's super fantastic if you see the amount of papers that's been published at the moment and the amount of breakthrough we are having. Although there might be people and skeptics that believe that it starts to slow down, but as computing power, et cetera, is keep on increasing and we're getting more and more innovative, there is no doubt that this is just a fantastic technology trend. So, but what about us? How do our grandparents feel about this? How does our mother, our family members, how do they feel about this? How do people in general feel about AI? I think that's a very important question. Because without that being solved, and without understanding that, well, we will keep on being excited about this, but it's a little bit like Dr. Strangelove saying how I learned to love the bomb, and it will all be super exciting because you're in the middle of this, but it might not be very exciting for the people who actually has to live really with this technology. So it's an important question to ask. And if you would go out and ask people, so how do you feel about AI? Many people would say, whew, it sounds a bit scary. Will I have a job? I mean, just anecdotally, I have many times within telecom and also outside talked excitedly about zero touch. And I love that topic of zero touch because it has so much potential and it triggers the mind, it challenges the mind, how do you get to a zero touch network? Particularly for all of us here, for some of us in telecom, it's a super cool challenge to solve, right? But I also sometimes see people when I talk about this, think, what does it mean? Zero touch? It means I will not have a job. And yes, I can get very excited about this, but I also understand why there are people that might be much less excited about this. So we need to understand this better. And the fact of the matter is, AI, machine learning, what we do today, will impact people's job in the future. Maybe not next year, maybe not 2 years from now, but it will impact it. And you see the trend already happening in China in manufacturing, where people are literally being sent back home in the rural areas, and machine manufacturing plants are being totally taken over quite massively by robots, because that starts to be a better return on business case. So, being very interested in this, I started some surveys. I've done 3 surveys. At the moment, had about 1,200 paid responses. It's not a lot, but if you do SurveyMonkey and you have to finance it yourself, this already is pretty expensive. I also, on top, had roughly about 430 social media responses where I looked into it, but it's less unbiased in some respects because it's very much people I know, it's people I've connected with, it's people in the industry. But nevertheless, some interesting stuff comes out of that too, because it shows how do we look at some of this versus what people in general would look at in a proper statistical way. So whenever you hear me talk and show the other results, typically you have to take a little bit of ground on result because there's thousands and thousands of people who have been surveyed. It's still a limited sample. But you can compensate for that from a statistical point of view. So what is the survey about? So if you go to SurveyMonkey, you will see that the easiest way to set up this is actually the US population. So a lot of this addresses the US population, but I have some insights in what does it actually mean for Europeans and Indians. Why do I say Indians? Because in my social network, LinkedIn, I'm actually connected to proportionally more Indians than I am to others. So you could get that. 2 surveys, which typically were limited to 18 to 75, and where I said that I want the household income to be higher than 75,000. This roughly addresses about 30% of households in the US. Why did I do that? Because I was very interested in how does decision makers, how does managers feel about this, particularly from a decision logic perspective, and where you have AI that actually has a mission in how we make decisions and maybe augmenting how we make decisions or potentially take over our decision process. I've written a couple of blogs on that, and I think there will be a reference in there. You can go and have a look at it. The interesting thing, when we talk about AI, I think that everybody in here has heard about AI, right? That's probably 100%. But there still is a surprising number of people that hasn't heard about AI yet until they did this survey, I suppose. So it was roughly between 8% to about 14%. 14% in a fully strategized survey, 8% if you limit it to a household income above the 75,000. So not too surprising. So one of the questions is, if you start asking people, and not just us, but people really outside our field, outside our job, well, how much do you think you are being touched by AI? How much are you being exposed to AI? And some of the interesting thing here is actually that people are aware, maybe they are somehow inflated in their awareness, but they are aware that AI is sort of prevalent in everything in their daily life. And of course, they've heard about Siri. They cannot have helped understand that there's something going on with Facebook at the moment. I think we all are reading this. It's very much pronounced in the news. So people are aware that this is something that already today impacts their daily life. And one of the things that I've been very interested in for some of the reasons, particularly when it comes to decision making and how AI could impact decision making, is, are there any gender differences? Are women feeling different about AI than men? I think that's very interesting. And it's often forgotten because most of us that is designing AI systems and cool stuff there, well, I think it's fair to say that probably more 80–90% of the ones who are doing this is men. And you're forgetting very easily the other 50%, the better half of our society. In this case, there is no difference between men and women. So how do you feel about AI? Maybe before I show it in here, so in terms of comfortable with about AI, happy about it, are you loving AI, are you hating AI? It's quite an interesting question because it gives a kind of sentiment at this moment of time. How do people really feel about AI? And there definitely is a difference between men and women. You can argue surprisingly or maybe not. I would say that some of this data is even more structured than this, so there are more detail below. So women in general are, I would say, fairly positive about AI. Neutral, of course, could go either way, and it's very clear. I've done this over time now, so I see that there is a trend where over time the neutral becomes more polarized. It goes either to negative, it goes to positive. And the same for men. So men is positive about this. They are optimistic about this. They feel good about it. There are surprisingly many men that love AI. I don't know why they love it, that you feel comfortable with it, that you are sort of positive about what it means, they can understand, but love it. Well, that maybe is the difference between Mars and Venus, I don't know. So now what happens if you have a child below 18? Now, if you're a woman, surprisingly not too much. You can always argue that you might get marginally more positive about AI, but it's not statistically actually with the data I have here, I cannot really say there's a big difference. Now look at men. Wow. So as a man, you have a child that is younger than 18, the future is brilliant. With AI, this is like you get just energized by this. And most of us as men have had young children. We know that this changes completely our outlook on many things, right? Oxytocin is streaming through our neural pathways, and serotonin. All the neurochemistry is just making us prepared to be a dad, and our outlook changes completely. We are more positive. When it comes to AI, we are surprisingly positive. And this is sort of, it's of course fun, but it also means that when you're designing AI into your systems, into technologies, you should be aware that maybe sometimes it's easier to get a man to adapt to this than maybe a woman. Women tend to be more skeptical, or at least not as positive as men. So that was an interesting one. Let's just wrap up here. Now, another question which I've been finding very interesting, okay, so out of this other one, I had another survey follow up on this and saying, so if you think about AI, how that will impact your child or children's future in terms of work and income, how do you feel about this? And I'm sorry for making this too much complicated, but I was really interested. Is it much worse than today? Worse than today? So pretty much about the same, right? Or is it better, or much better than today? So this is sort of a similar kind of thing as the other one, but it's now trying to force you to think about your children. What is the future for them? In particular, the future that would be impacted by AI. So again, there is a little bit more blurry story. Men, even without children, are sort of, yeah, it's probably okay, better than today for sure. Women seems here to be a bit more positive. Does anything happen when you go to the group of men and women that has children under 18, oh yeah, it's around the same. There you see the men getting really positive again for the children, etc. Now, you shouldn't find this surprising. I had I think a couple of years ago, we had a talk with our son's teacher, and my son's teacher was a bit worried, and my wife, mother of my son, was worried. And I said, I don't get it. Come on, my son is the most brilliant person on earth. I mean, you cannot complain about he doesn't write the letters in the right way or something. Come on, what is going on here? There's not going to be a big deal. And the teacher and my wife, of course, look at me. Hey. And my teacher says to me, well, you know, this is very normal. A dad, a father will always be much more positive in the outlook of his children than the wife or the mother. I said, oh, come on, don't tell me that I'm that biased. Like, when I research, and actually it is a fact. As a father, as a man with young children, you tend to be much more positive and much more protective of your child than, for example, the mother. I don't know if it has to do with the time they spent, but that's a different point. So yes, there are differences between men and women, and I don't think actually this is so surprising, but it's pretty cool that you actually trigger this out on it. So another question which is interesting, because I mean, if you really love this stuff, I mean, you must truly believe that there is no danger, there's no risk in your life in that. And indeed, if you start asking people, do you believe that an AI could replace, your job could be replaced by an AI? And by the way, you have to be a bit careful with this question. There's many surveys here, because I am sort of asking, I mean, if you read this question, you would think that this is actually now. I'm not really trying to get you to think about this in a long term. So people that are answering this question would tend to be very much anchored in the moment or sort of the near future. And they're pretty bullish, and this is driven by decision makers, right? So this is really driven by people that has a household income, or managers, decision makers with household income more than 75. So no. 15% and yes, and if you go into detail of this data, then you start seeing some interesting things, because if you're an entry-level manager, or you're entering into the company, actually 50% of those believe that their job could be taken over by an AI. If you start becoming a CXO, you're not replaceable. Oh, come on, AI cannot replace me. Now that's an interesting one, because we have Jack May, who said, hey, in the next 30 years, actually, I can easily imagine a robot doing my job, be on the front of Times Magazine as the best CEO. And if you go in and look at some of the statements around this, there's been some in Harvard Business Review and other notable journals about how could AI impact real executive decision makers. You see pretty much the same trend. I'll not go into more detail on that. If you go in and read my blog, you will find a more cynical view on this one. But if you ask the C-level executives, founders of companies, they actually say about 30% of them says that they do believe that the job could be replaced by an AI. So there are some reflection here. Now, going into corporate decisions and what that actually means, so AI and I. And there's a lot of data here, and I won't go through everything, but if you get the presentation, you will find much more slides in here than actually I'm presenting. So would you trust an AI with a critical corporate decision? Anyone in here? Would you trust? AI says this, you would? I would, but you don't need to agree with me. But you already see, if you look around, there are certainly people who are not so comfortable about that. And why is that? So I asked the question, would you trust a critical corporate decision made by a fellow human expert or superior? Oh yeah, yes, 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 we all would. Clear, come on. My colleague making a decision is the most unbiased colleague I've ever met. And if he's a good colleague and he's in my tribe, he's most likely going to make a decision that's good for me. So sure, I will trust him, even if it's a crappy decision. That, by the way, I didn't ask. So what happens if you ask the same question in terms of AI? So it goes from 53, with frequently always trusting, to 12%. No, absolutely freaking no. And this is not, I mean, you could argue this is a great finding, and of course, initially I saw this one, interesting, right? But there are work done by Chicago University and a guy called Dieter Voshaus, who talks about algorithmic aversion or algorithmic allergy. And it's well known in literature that if you ask people whether they trust an algorithm or a mathematical approach to decision making, they'll say no, don't. Oh, a little bit, but no, actually not. So AI aversion analogy is definitely a real thing in a corporate environment that deals with decisions. And this is just a little bit of the data space that I have collected, but it's a very big, big thing. So when it comes to decision, why is it like this? Well, first of all, we as decision makers believe we are the best to make decisions. So if you start looking at it, again, there is really nothing new here. I'm just basically confirming what literature has already shown, is that we all believe we are better than our peers. Of course, statistically, that's not really possible, right? But I'm definitely better than my peer. So that's one thing. Women are a bit more realistic in this sense. And this is, again, also found in literature. If you go in and look at stockbrokers, it's been done some in New York Stock Exchange, or investment managers, you definitely do not want to have a male investment manager or broker. You would very much like to have a woman. Unfortunately, there are not that many of them there. But if you want to have a better return on your investment, you should ask for having a woman as your stockbroker or your investment manager, not a man. Because statistically, they make more losses. Their frequency of trading is much, much higher than the frequency of trading of women. So there's not really anything new here. But hey, in a corporate segment, how many women do we have on executive positions, high management positions? Not that many, right? But you now have this sort of confirmation bias, a male chauvinist bias, that we are definitely much better, all of us, than our peers, which is an impossibility. So in terms of gut feel, how many of us are using our gut to make decisions? Well, there's a lot of stuff below that. I'm not going to get into it. Well, I would say if you're an entry level, generally you would say, well, I'm sort of slightly better. It's a little bit more balanced. If you're a CXO, my God, you are God. Your gut feeling is the best ever invented, and it's definitely better than anybody else. So again, is it surprising that we don't really trust AIs when we believe we are so good at making our own decisions? Why do we need any augmentation or help? By the way, again, this is not something new. People already knew this back in the 80s, where there was a lot of research done in this area, both from a psychological behavioral point of view, but also some pure decision logic point of view. So now, interesting thing is, can you trick this? So would we treat AI in the same way as we treat our fellow? I think you already know the answer to that. So would you trust a corporate decision made by a fellow human whose success rate is better than 70%, which is actually pretty good? If you look at how, I mean, sure, we have a lot of post-rationalization that says that whatever decision we made is pretty good. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be a CXO or something like that. But in general, 53%, or just frequently to always, be okay with trusting somebody who has a success rate that's better than 70%, which is, again, pretty high if you look at it actualized. Now, what happens with an AI who has exactly the same success rate? Absolutely not. No. Interesting, right? So AIs are held to a much stricter standard than our fellow humans. And one of the many studies on this area shows that as soon as an algorithm or a tool is making a mistake, you will not forget that mistake. Even if it's just once, you will be forever skeptic. If a human being makes a mistake, that's okay. Well, you will be upset, but you forget it again because it's a human being, right? So that's very interesting, and it also shows us if we're going to implement this in our decision process, business processes, we have to consider this. Because you can kill this before you even get started if you have too many unsuccessful results, such as having an Uber car driving by itself and driving down a woman crossing the street. Could stop the whole thing before it really gets started, because, oh shit, this is totally unacceptable. If a bloke does it, or a woman does it, in a car driving down, which happens quite frequently all over the world, all the day, every hour of a day, pretty much. Well, that's okay because it's a human being doing it, right? So one of the things that's come up very lately is really are AIs more objective than humans? Are humans more objective than AIs? And I can tell you from all the research done, AI, of course, are biased very clearly. But it's a hell of a lot less biased than we are as human beings. And you can read Kahneman and Trotsky, you can read a lot of literature that pretty much proves this. We are not rational beings in the sense of a pure Mr. Spock in Star Trek. So if you ask people, are we more objective than AIs? Answer is very clearly, yes, we are. And that's definitely a fallacy, because we really are. Of course, the question is, how do you define objectivity? Some of this is always because if you start looking at how this has trended over the last 12 months, you will see that due to a lot of the discussions about biased AI, people start realizing that there is definitely bias in AI, but there's not been a lot of discussion about how we human beings are biased, which might be a much more interesting question. But this is something we forget. Women in general are even more convinced that humans are more objective than AIs, which might, to some extent, also explain sort of the less enthusiasm about that. Let me go, because I'm going out. So do we trust companies using AI in their products and services to have your best interest in mind? What do you think the answer is? No. And they might actually be agreeably right, particularly with the last discussion about Facebook, although I would say Facebook, I really believe that they generally believe, I believe that they generally believe that they have the best interest in mind of their users. But with the latest discussions about Cambridge Analytics, etc., people might not necessarily be that. But clearly, that's a message to us as a company, right? Because if people don't really believe that we have the best interest in mind, they will also be skeptical, and they might not adapt as quickly as we would really like them to do. So what about something that I've been spending really a lot of time on, and sorry for ringing a bell, is how you describe the level of confidence in political institutions, government, lawmakers. Are they really adequately considering the medium and long-term social impact of AI? If you ask me, absolutely freaking not. I've had some talks back with some of the guys back in EU, European Union, and they were having their more hands-off, well, we'll just see how it goes. My God, right? But generally, people absolutely do not believe that there is enough being done on regulation and lawmaking in this area. And if you go by sort of low confidence to no confidence, women in general are more worried about this. About 82% are actually believing that it's certainly not enough. And I think that's a no-brainer, because there isn't done enough in this area. Definitely not. So do you believe this makes a better world? No. Well, 16%, AI will lead to a better world, and 26% with men. So again, men, it's a bit more optimistic in terms of what this could be, but again, not surprising given all the other ones. So this actually ends my presentation, or just with the message, AI aversion is a real thing, and there will be lots of text here, but that ends my presentation. Thank you.